Welcome to the seventh video in the first lesson where we're building the world for our action RPG. And in this one, our goal is going to be just setting up a few small things and kind of laying the foundation for some important things later down the road. So first up, let's start constructing tags. The player does need the player tag, so let's set his tag to player. And then I'm going to go through and start adding some tags that I think I'm going to need down the road for different things. First up, let's do a doodad tag, because we're going to be having some collisions with doodads, and a tag will help us identify if it's a doodad. Let's add an enemy tag, something we're going to have again later on. And then a few other ones that have some kind of weirder names. Launchable. And a launchable item is going to be like an interactive thing I can hit with my sword and move it. Speaking of interactive, I'm going to have another thing called interactable. That's going to be switches and the like. Going to have another one called a hazard. So things that I can bump into that may hurt me. And lastly, one called terrain. And that's for anything that may speed up the player or slow the player or an ice effect. So I'm just adding these tags. Right now, the only one that I'm really going to use is the doodad tag, but this will help speed up some of the videos in the future when we have to actually do stuff with enemies. So with that done, let's go tag all of the doodads to be a doodad. So the stump is a doodad, the tree is a doodad, and it blocks projectiles. Reeds are doodads. The small bush is a doodad, and the barrel is. Alright, those are not all tagged. With the changes that we've made to player, we can probably turn the player into a prefab at this point. And so I'm going to go to prefabs and make a new folder called player. And I'm going to put the player into that prefabs folder. So now any changes I want to make to the player, I probably should do so by editing the prefab of the player by double-clicking it at that point. Then the next one is actually something that's going to facilitate collisions, and it's going to be an interesting thing to change. And so that's going to be under. So if I select the player, and I can probably do it on the prefab, where it says layer, these are actually my physics collision layers. So I want to go to add a new layer. And inside of here, you can see I've got some pre-built ones, but I do want to add a few new user layers. I want to add ground, and I want to add air. Because what I eventually want to have set up, and default is going to be default. So I'm kind of thinking of a, there are three types of colliders, and maybe if I drew a MS Paint picture, it might make some sense. So for the collisions that I'm going to have inside of our game here, a ground collider is kind of like this. So we are ground colliders. The default collider is like this. And this is like a side view of things. And an air collider is like this. So, you know, if the player, this is my player. Basically, the idea is that ground colliders aren't going to interact with air with air physics. Air physics won't interact with ground physics, but the default collider will hit them both. So, like, my player is going to probably be on the default collider because I need things that are flying through the air, such as arrows, fireballs, and bats, to be able to hit the player. But the player needs to not be able to walk over ground colliders, such as tree stumps, barrels, or water. And so that's kind of what the setup for what these colliders are going to do. Like the air collider will hit a default collider because the default collider is, in my vision, tall enough to intercept air. So that's what we're going to try to do with these colliders. To actually make that happen, though, we do need to go to Edit, Project Settings, and you can see that has that layer is open. If we go to Physics 2D, we actually can also change the gravity right here. Turn off the gravity if we really want, because we really have no need for gravity in this game, so I am going to turn that off. This layer collision matrix. This shows what layers are allowed to collide with other layers. So for example, the air layer can collide with the ground layer, which is what we don't want. So we're going to uncheck that box. But the default layer can collide with air and ground. Ground can collide with ground, air can collide with air. So that's the collision matrix. Based on how things may work out, we may turn off air colliding with air to let like flying enemies kind of pass through each other. Some games do that. We'll see how that looks when we get to there. So anyway, we can now safely close this. And let's go actually assign these, because this is actually an important part of setting up new scenes, which is what we're about to get to. So the blocking low, that was originally meant to just be the water. And so here's kind of my blocking low, ignoring my doodads and stuff. I would think that a flying thing, such as an arrow or a bat, should not collide with this, because it would just fly straight over it. So my blocking low, instead of being on the default layer, I want to switch it to the ground layer, so that it's only going to have physics intersections with other things on default, because default hits everything, and other ground objects. But it will not hit air objects. Blocking high, which are my cliffs, I still want to leave that on default because I want it to still block air things. I mean, there's something to think about that, whether or not I want to allow that. But yeah, I basically don't want arrows and fireballs and bats to fly above blocking high. So we turn all these back on. Now, the same could be said for doodads. So for instance, barrel does have a collider, so it does interfere with things. So should an arrow or a bat be able to fly over a barrel? And I would think yes. A bat should be able to fly over a bush, so a bush should be on the ground layer. Reeds, because they don't have a collider, honestly don't matter, but I'm gonna make them ground anyway. The tree is default because a tree is tall enough to block arrows, bats, and fireballs. And a tree stump probably should just be on the ground layer because an arrow could fly over that or a bat could fly over that. Now, we hit play. Since I didn't interact with the player at all, I didn't change the player, we don't notice anything. But just for the sake of testing, let's go to the player prefab and let's put the player on the air layer. And let's see what happens when the player is now on the, is considered to be flying. You'll notice that I don't collide with anything that was set to the ground layer, but I still collide with this because that's, blocking my movement. Now, as a developer, we have to be very careful if we're going to allow the player to ever get on the air layer, because it does let the player just kind of like ignore the level, ignores the barrels, because I'm flying. But I don't ignore the tree because the tree is considered to be a tall thing. I can ignore fences, and I ignore tree stumps. So that should demonstrate what we're going to achieve by setting these different physics layers. Now the player does need to return back to the default because I want the player to be hit by ground things and air things. So we're going back to default layer. If we put the player on the ground, it would never collide with like missiles and stuff. And so we're back to normal. So that kind of set a lot of this up. The player is now a prefab so that we can very quickly build new levels. I do not recommend turning our tile maps into prefabs because Unity gets very upset if you make this into a prefab, and it's more difficult to break it out of a prefab. So unfortunately, we will have to rebuild this grid every time. So, and I think that's kind of all I really wanted to achieve with this video. Is just kind of a quick thing where we just change some of these layers, we get some of the tags set up so that we are ready for future things. So I'm going to hit save, and then in the next video we're going to load up some new tile sets and then make 3 quick new scenes before we can start scene transitioning. So thank you for watching.